Okay. All right. Well, there's a pause in the conversation. I'll go ahead and start. Thank you all for coming. My name's Carolyn Bach. I'm the president of the St. Genevieve Art Guild, and very pleased to be here. Glad you all could come. And we're talking tonight about celebrating Audubon's legacy. And he left a quite big legacy. He was not only really renowned as an artist, but he was also a naturalist. And appropriate for Earth Day, he was an environmentalist. He was one of the first who ever started talking about the concerns about nature disappearing at the hand of man. And so not only was he that, he was also a scientist and a bit of a marketing guru. I'll talk about that a little later. I'm trying to keep it about 15 minutes, just so you know. There's cake afterwards, so there's a reward at the end of this. You know. We have Audubon's birthday cake. It's only 237 years old. So the exhibit we have out here is inspired by nature, which again is appropriate for Earth Day. We're really glad it coincided that way. Audubon's birthday is actually on Tuesday, so we're kind of sandwiched between the two. We're also opening the exhibit behind me, which is dedicated to Audubon as a portrait artist, and that's something not a lot of people know about him. But he came together doing portraits out of necessity. He much preferred painting birds to people. And this was something he took on because he needed the money. But he was also very good at it. So 1822 is 200 years ago, and you'll see that date on a lot of the things here. 1822, things kind of came together for these two men. This is Ferdinand Rozier, this is John James Audubon, both painted in 1822. They were business partners up until 1811. And in 1811, their contract, which is here on loan from the Museum Learning Center, was broken. And Audubon left St. Genevieve. And a lot of people thought the two hadn't gotten along. That wasn't quite true. They were lifelong friends. And these friends got together again around about 1822. And we know that because in Ferdinand Rozier's correspondence, he spent Christmas Eve with Audubon in 1822. And he gave him the bird in 1822. He gave him this bird back. Audubon had left this bird painting of a ruffed grouse in St. Genevieve with Rozier. And Rozier took good care of it and gave it back to Audubon. Why would he do that? Well, in 1822, these two men had come a long way in a decade. Mr. Rozier had found a great deal of success, financial success. He was not only into the financial part of the mercantile business, he'd also gotten into mining. He was doing very well. Audubon, on the other hand, was doing very badly financially. He had gone bankrupt in 1819. He blamed himself, but it was really a downturn in the economy. The banks failed. They pulled in their loans. He was overfinanced. He lost everything. Even ended up in debtor's prison, the poor guy. He really sunk to the bottom and then realized that he could fall back on his art. So he had to get serious about his art. Up until that point, he'd been this was a hobby, a gentleman's pastime, while he made money in business. Now he decided to get serious about it. So he began doing portraits of people. And back then it was sort of, I don't know if you've seen some of the old ones where they're all in profile and they're black and white. And that's how he started. And he sold those for $5. Well, then he got a little better and he started making portraits where the person was halfway facing you. It's called a three-quarter turn. And so they're much more personable, realistic, beautiful portraits. He got really, really good at it. These two were made in 1820. By the time he made this portrait, which is of Jean-Baptiste Bozier, which some of you may recognize as someone from St. Genevieve, he was really good. In fact, this is probably one of his best charcoal portraits that he ever did. But he was getting tired of doing the charcoal because it didn't make much money, and he wanted to do oil. So he took some lessons in 1822. And the first oil painting he did was of himself. So did he also do oil portraits on commission from his old partner, who he was in contact with? We don't know. It says John James Audubon ? Because circumstantially you would think so, but he didn't sign it. So the original of these portraits is held by the Missouri Historical Society. They've been there since 1955. And they were donated by the Rozier family. So that gives them some importance. But we still don't know. So I can't really tell you if those are Audubon's or not. But fortunately, we have somebody coming tomorrow who's a real historian, not just a storyteller like myself. And his name is James Baker, and he's the former superintendent of the Felix Valley Historic Site, which happens to be Jean-Baptiste Bozier's old store. So that particular connection is going to lend a lot of information tomorrow, and I can't wait to find out what he's found out at the Missouri Historical Society, because James Baker can read the old French correspondence that they're holding that we're hoping will shed some light on these portraits. This, by the way, is Constance Rozier, and these two paintings were done in a set of two. The second set was set to Rozier's mother in France in 1822. So that's kind of circumstantially what was going on. I'll leave it there. But I should mention that everything here is a reproduction. They're darn good reproductions. Some people have walked up and gone, 1822, oh my gosh. These were done on the permission of the people who owned them, in this case the Missouri Historic Society, gave us an image. I took that image to one of our members, Bill Nager, who has Merchant Street Gallery down the road. These are called giclée. They're printed on canvas. And he did a wonderful job with what we gave him. Anna Kirchner helped frame them and stretch the canvas for us, but all of these were done by Bill Nager. All of the reproductions. He didn't do the book and he didn't do the bird, but everything else is something that Bill Nager reproduced for us. So he's not here to be thanked because he's currently in the final rehearsal of Hope is a Shy Bird, and he's playing the Elder Audubon. And I hope all of you will go see that production. It's an amazing amount of talent in this town that has produced this play. It's been written by a local playwright, and it's cast by all local people. So the most exciting reproduction that Bill and I were involved in was this contract. This was preserved by a descendant of Ferdinand Rozier. Ferdinand Rozier lived a long life. He lived into his 80s. Poor Audubon died at an earlier age, and Rozier was 8 years older, but he lived another 10 years beyond him. By that time, Audubon was famous. So anything that Audubon signed, touched, owned, was all of a sudden worth something. And those artifacts were given by Ferdinand Rozier to his 5 sons. So he didn't leave them in his will. He meted them out while he was alive. And it went from the oldest son to the oldest son to the oldest son to the oldest son. And some of those oldest sons have chosen to share some of their family heirlooms with us, which is cool. One of them is a box of birds. We call them stuffed birds. Audubon called them bird skins, but they're full of arsenic, which we think is part of what made Audubon sent to an early grave. But anyway, they're in a box, and they are at the Museum Learning Center, and they are on loan from a Rozier family member. The other thing that was on loan from a Rozier family member is a contract, but this is a copy. But the Rozier family let us make a copy of that. And we want to share these portraits with the Rozier family if we can as well, because they have, for the most part, been locked away and not really seen. So the other thing that struck me when I was looking at these portraits was this is not your typical portrait of John James Audubon. We know him as we've seen him on our posters with long flowing hair and a wolf skin coat and a gun by his side. This, he looks very much like Rozier. He's a very respectable businessman, okay? So this is how he saw himself in 1822. The one with the long hair and the gun and the coat is 4 years later. But a lot happened in that 4 years. He finally made enough money making all these portraits, and his poor little wife working as a teacher, to afford passage to England to get his Birds of America printed. And so he went there, and the first thing they did was they wanted to make his portrait. His publisher wanted him to be portrayed as the woodsman. Reason is, they had just gotten through everyone reading The Last of the Mohicans. This was the big book back then that really caught fire in England. And so the American frontier was exotic, it was exciting, and here comes Natty Bumppo in the form of John James Audubon. He was the toast of the town. He even put bear grease in his hair sometimes. He played it to the hilt. And this guy was doing what we would call crowdfunding back in the 19th century. He was actually going from party to party to party, being invited by this person and that person because he was suddenly a celebrity. And he played it to the hilt. Every time he went, he said, "Oh, you need to buy a subscription to my book." And he raised, in today's dollars, over $2 million. But that did not make him rich. He was making a book this big called An Elephant Folio, and it cost him that $2 million to make all of those because they came out in a series. So if you subscribe to this, you only got a few drawings at a time over a period of time. And he would run back across the Atlantic and paint more birds, come back to England, get them engraved, come back across the Atlantic. He must have crossed the Atlantic a dozen times. And it took him 12 years to make this book, to get the Birds of America published. So he's quite the interesting guy. He was really ahead of his time. The article I read about his portrait said that he wasn't particularly adept at oil painting, and I want to disagree. When he got to Scotland, not only did they paint him, but he started painting in oil great big portraits of birds. And I was down at Crystal Bridges in Arkansas at their museum, and it's all American art. And it's a beautiful place. And when you walk in, it's 4 foot high, 5 foot wide, a whole family of Audubon's favorite bird, the turkey. And it just knocked me over. I just was so taken with that painting because it's just so good. And it was the thing I remember about the whole trip to that museum was that particular painting. He used those in Scotland to raise money, again, for his book. And he didn't like painting in oil as much as he did watercolor, but again, he did it because that was more lucrative. And so the Birds of America is still something that resonates with us today. Prior to Audubon, everything was made from dead specimens, and they were very stiff and unlifelike. He found a way to bring life to all of that and to ended up with 435 life-size watercolors, and that's why the book was so big. And it's impressive even today. It's become very scarce. It was the most expensive book of natural history ever made, and it continues to be that. But his contribution was not just artistic, it was scientific. In the process, he identified 25 new bird species, described them to science, and it also included birds that have disappeared. If you read his journals, the one that really struck me was the passenger pigeon. It was a pigeon that would only exist in a huge flock of millions of birds, and it was slaughtered because they were good to eat. But people would, like the bison, would kill more than they needed. And once the population got to a critical number, that was it. So Audubon became one of the first environmentalists because he started writing about this. He said, hey people, this is not a irreplaceable resource. It's something that we need to care for. And so it was when the Audubon Society came along, it was actually founded by a guy who was a teacher, Audubon's wife, who was a teacher, had taught him as a boy. So he grew up hearing about Audubon and Audubon's care for the nature and all of this, and that's why the society ended up being named after him. He had witnessed all this over-harvesting because he had traveled more than any other artist or naturalist in his day. I mean, this guy was a wanderer. He was all over the place, north to Labrador, down to the Keys. I mean, even went out west. And so he really did know what was going on more than anyone else with the nature of this land. In summary, there's some artists in the crowd, and I think there's some lessons to be learned from Audubon that I'd like to pass on to the artists in the crowd. First of all, don't be defined by one medium or one subject. Audubon pretty much tried them all. And try new things. Give it that three-quarter turn. Make it different. And if you really want to make it big, it might be necessary to reinvent yourself and get a new hairdo, you know. And promote yourself to a foreign audience. That wouldn't hurt either. And do something with your art that you're passionate about. And for heaven's sakes, please sign your work. So thank you all for coming. I will take any questions, but if anyone's hungry, the cake has been cut. So, if anybody wants to ask anything,
it was 200 years ago.
There you go. Yeah, it was 200 years ago. Yeah. So, like I said, the real expert's coming tomorrow. So,
did he live in St. Genevieve?
Did who live in St. Genevieve?
John.
He did for about 8 weeks. Right. So, where at? Probably right here on Merchant Street. We don't know for sure. He and Rozier had a partnership, and they set up a little shop when they came here. They had brought with them 200 barrels of Kentucky Monongahela whiskey, which they had bought for $0.25 and they sold for $2. So it was a successful trip, other than they got stuck on the Mississippi ice for about all winter and had to wait for the ice to break up to get here. But yeah, they did have a store here for a short time. My theory is that Audubon was recognized, that both of the men were recognized. They were actually neighbors back in France. Their families knew one another. His father knew that this guy was a little bit sharper in business than his son, and so he made an agreement with the two fathers that these two would go into partnership. And so Rozier actually took a little heat after they broke up, that it didn't work out. But Audubon had a skeleton in his closet. His dad made him never tell anyone that he was illegitimate. And so I really think that when he got here, he was discovered by the Frenchmen that were already here. There were so many people here. It was a smaller world back then. And I really think to save face, he had to leave. That's what I is, again, from my research. So
are the Roziers who remain in this community descendants of this gentleman?
Yes, they are. Yeah. They're all descendants, as far as I know, of Ferdinand Rozier. He had a big family, and they all had big families, and there's a book written about them that's in our library called Between the Gabaree, which we have the North Gabaree, South Gabaree. And, I mean, it's this thick with family. So that's how we knew the first son to the first son thing. But yeah, no, it's great. They were very. 5 of them were mayors of the town, and so it was good stuff. Historians, all that. So they added a lot to the town. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Please enjoy the exhibit.